After millions of infections and deaths and the worst economic crash since the Great Depression, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to impact the modern world. But the pandemic also brings opportunity to consider the future of the United States in many ways. That's according to Thomas Wright. He's a director and senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. His new book is Aftershocks: Pandemic Politics and the End of the Old International Order. The book is co-written by Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Colin Kahl. Tom, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You say this in your book, quote, "There is never a good time for a pandemic, but the novel coronavirus hit the world at perhaps the worst possible moment, when international cooperation had largely broken down after a tumultuous decade. The fact that world leaders were hardly on speaking terms and could not even arrange to meet to discuss the pandemic is a stark illustration of this." Tom, why had international cooperation broken down so badly?
Yeah, it was a tough decade. You know, after the financial crisis, populism rose around the world. China became more, even more authoritarian under Xi Jinping, as did, Russia. When Donald Trump was elected, there was real pressure on those multilateral institutions, and we saw this rising geopolitical rivalry really, from the beginning of the decade, from when Xi Jinping took over, but between the United States and China. So all of that, I think, came together to mean that in 2019 and 2020, when this hit, it was fundamentally different than in 08, 09, when we had an economic crisis. So you remember then, the world got together with the G20, they put aside their differences and tried to basically solve the crisis. This time, they were hardly speaking to each other and definitely weren't cooperating with each other on the worst pandemic in 100 years.
I was going to say, even the Europeans weren't working with each other within
Right.
Europe.
Yeah, I mean, that was a really interesting piece of it. The EU works on almost everything in any individual European country except for health policy. So health policy has always been the domain of national government. So when this crisis hit, the EU really had no sort of idea what to do. They were actually even behind the Trump administration in realizing sort of how severe it was. And then there was this mad scramble for, scarce medical supplies. So they were, taking it from each other, competing with each other. And it took them quite a while, to really realize that if they didn't work together, it could be the end of the EU. And so they did begin to do that after a few months, but they also had a very rocky road at the beginning.
So how has the pandemic affected the US-China relationship? Because it wasn't that good to begin with before the pandemic.
No, it was, there was increased rivalry, and, Trump obviously was quite hostile in his rhetoric to China. But it's interesting that in mid-January 2020, just when this thing was getting started, you remember the United States and China signed a trade agreement, a phase 1 trade agreement. And Trump saw this as maybe the beginning of a broader agreement, or at least some better relations with Xi Jinping and China. So when it sort of hit, there was, a moment when there was a little bit of a thaw. But what the pandemic did really, I think, was turbocharge the rivalry. Because on the one hand, it showed that China wouldn't cooperate with the international community on a pandemic. And on the other hand, Trump blamed China and basically endorsed those in his administration who wanted to, try to contain it. And what we saw in the subsequent sort of 10 or 11 months was really a wide array of measures to try to contain, China's sort of rise in assertive foreign policy.
And China's still not cooperating, even today.
Right. Even today, there was an investigative team from the WHO, that went in, and there were real sort of doubts about, about the effectiveness of that team because of the influence that China had, on it. And the Director General of the WHO has complained that China is still not providing critical data and information to establish the origins, of COVID-19.
You mentioned the World Health Organization. Why couldn't they bring countries together? Isn't that their job in a health crisis?
Yeah, they basically had this nightmare scenario at the beginning where they had on the one hand Xi Jinping and on the other hand Trump, and so they were literally like stuck, between them. And the Director General's Tedros's philosophy and modus operandi in this situation was to try to praise these leaders publicly and get some sort of practical cooperation, but that alienated the United States, which I think correctly believed that he was overlooking some of the real deficiencies in China's, response and not putting pressure on them, as the WHO previously did in SARS, to cooperate more with the international community.
And do you think that the World Health Organization is permanently weakened and affected by that, or is there a way for them to come back and be strengthened again so that they can take their role in another health crisis that might come down the road?
I think just in the crisis that we had, it's a mixed report card, right? They didn't put enough pressure on China, and they sort of compromised themselves early on, but they did actually also do a lot of good work, and they were in a very difficult position, and they ultimately, are not really all that independent. They have to account to the member states, particularly the large, member states. But going forward, I think it's really hard because, and what we're likely to see is that the WHO and global public health governance generally will become this zone of competition between, democracies on the one hand and China on the other, and so we're unlikely to see China ever really agree to the levels of transparency needed, to assuage our concerns about some of what's going on, there. So I think in the same way in the early Cold War period, the UN, there was a lot of hope for that in the 1940s, and that became bogged down in differences between the Soviets and the US. So too, sort of here, there's a lot of hope for reform, but it may well get bogged down in differences between the United States and China.
Tom, your subtitle, The End of the Old International Order, what does that mean? Why has it ended, and what's the new international order?
Yeah, I think what we're trying to sort of get at there is two things. One, the idea that the major powers, that China, the United States, and the EU are all going to sort of work together to tackle these common problems, in international institutions, that is no longer, we can no longer assume that, right? That we just saw this major crisis with almost no cooperation, and we're sort of in a different world now, particularly with the United States and China. And the second part of it is that, we assumed also that organizations like the WHO, that the US would sort of shape and lead those pretty automatically, right? And they would reflect the values and interests of democracies. And that's not true either. And so, we need to cooperate to prepare for future pandemics, but we also need to realize that the international order has changed, and we can't just count on organizations like the WHO or assume that world leaders will come together, to deal with these threats in the future.
Well, the Trump administration had disengaged from international institutions. The Biden administration is re-engaging in those institutions and with the rest of the world and with our allies. So can't we go back to the old international order?
They are, yeah, Biden is re-engaging, but even there you see Biden administration officials raise concerns about China's influence in the WHO, about the investigations that the WHO has ongoing, that they haven't gone far enough. And I think the broader, problem is that even for, a liberal internationalist administration like, President Biden's, they still have that rivalry, with China, and that will affect the future path of the WHO. And all around the world, there are lots of nationalist leaders like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and many others who aren't going to cooperate in the same way. And so we need to basically prepare for future sort of threats and challenges, assuming that we won't have the same levels of cooperation that we did in the financial crisis.
But let's drill down on that. So yeah. How do we prepare? How do we adjust to this new world order to position the U.S. in a better place for other global crises?
Yeah, so in the book, we argue that the U.S. needs to try to work with China, needs to engage in the WHO for sure. But we also need a backup plan if that doesn't work, right? And the backup plan that we propose is that the US would bring together like-minded countries in what we call a global alliance for pandemic preparedness that would commit to higher levels of transparency, higher levels of cooperation and coordination in the event of a future crisis, and do more on global public health, even if it's not required by the WHO. And so we need to set a standard that others can aspire to, and also in a future crisis those countries could come together and put pressure on other countries if they're not cooperating with the international community.
Do you think government leaders in this country have the political will to do what it takes to be prepared for the next global crises, pandemic or otherwise?
Yeah, I worry about that for sure. I worry that we could be in a situation where Republicans sort of believe that the problem was an overreaction to the pandemic. The country as a whole sort of believes vaccines could be the solution. The truth is, the next pandemic could be worse than COVID-19. It could be more lethal. It's not necessarily going to give younger people a pass on it. The great influenza of 1918, 1919 affected younger people disproportionately. So we need to take this really as a warning. What COVID has done, apart from the great hardship it's inflicted, is it's given us advance notice of future, threats, and we have to use that time to prepare for the worst case scenario in the hope of, averting it.
Tom, briefly in the time that we've got left, what do we do about the economic crater essentially caused by the COVID pandemic that, is going to have a long effect? And given that we have to pay for things like climate mitigation, I mean, how do we do that?
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing about the economic response was how overwhelming it was. That was one of the bits that actually did sort of work, especially from the central banks, internationally, and it was without really formally coordinating or cooperating, as was the case in the financial crisis. So that's sort of interesting. But as we look ahead, I think what worries me is, the developing world, which I think has largely been left behind on this, and the question about whether or not we're really going to have a global effort to have the global economy recover, and if we can come up with sort of a new economic model that balances the need for resilience on supply chains and other things, with also the need to have an open global economy with trade and, and the interaction that we saw before the pandemic.
All right. Well, Tom, thanks so much for joining me, and very interesting perspective. I appreciate it.